You're my mom." The courtroom fell silent. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel heavy, the kind that stretched so long it made people forget to breathe. Judge Rebecca Hayes, a woman known for her composure and unshakable presence, blinked in surprise. The words had come from the little boy standing in front of her, his dark brown eyes wide with something between hope and certainty. The boy was no more than 10, small for his age, with tightly coiled hair and a nervous grip on the edges of his oversized shirt. His voice trembled, but his eyes never wavered. "I know you," he whispered. "You're my mom." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A lawyer dropped his pen. Someone's chair scraped against the wooden floor. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen it all, shifted uncomfortably. Judge Hayes gripped the edge of her bench, her knuckles white. She had been expecting a simple custody case, an ordinary day in court. But this was something else. "Excuse me," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. The boy nodded eagerly, stepping closer, as if he was afraid she would disappear. "I remember you," he said louder now. "I don't know how, but I do. You're my mom." "You are." Murmurs filled the room. The attorneys exchanged confused glances. Even the foster parents sitting in the back looked stunned. Judge Hayes felt her heartbeat in her throat. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. And yet, she swallowed hard, willing herself to stay calm. "Son," she said carefully, "I don't know who told you that, but you were there." The boy's voice cracked. "You were there when I was born. I remember your voice. Your smell. I remember." He choked on his words, and for a moment, he looked like he might cry. The courtroom waited, every single person frozen in place. Judge Hayes tried to process what was happening, but her mind kept spinning. Because deep down, in the part of her heart she never spoke about, something felt familiar. The boy's eyes. His face. This wasn't possible. But what if it was? 2 weeks earlier, Judge Rebecca Hayes had never been the emotional type. Her job required her to be objective, to see things in black and white. The law didn't care about feelings, and she had spent years training herself to be the same way. But when she read the file on Noah Bennett, something inside her hesitated. He had been found abandoned as a baby. No name, no records. He had bounced from one foster home to another, never staying anywhere too long. There was no information about his birth parents, no history of where he came from. The only thing known about him was that he had once been left in a hospital's care, with nothing but a thin blanket wrapped around him. Rebecca exhaled slowly. Cases like these weren't rare. The foster system was full of children without families. But something about this one felt different. She shook the feeling away. Today was just another hearing. Another case. That's what she told herself as she stepped into the courtroom that morning. She didn't know that her life was about to change forever. Noah sat in the back of the car, staring out the window as the city passed by. The social worker in the front seat kept glancing at him through the mirror, her lips pursed in thought. "You okay, buddy?" she finally asked. Noah shrugged. "You nervous?" He shrugged again. "Well," she sighed, "I get it. Court is a big deal." Noah didn't answer. He wasn't scared of court. He had been there too many times before. Every time, it was the same. Adults talked over him, shuffled papers, made decisions about his life without ever really looking at him. But today felt different. He didn't know why. All he knew was that, for the last few nights, he had been having the same dream. A voice. A warm presence. A smell he couldn't quite place, but somehow recognized. He didn't understand it. But deep in his heart, he knew one thing for sure. He was going to meet someone important today. Rebecca stepped into the courtroom, adjusting her robe as she took her seat. The room was filled with the usual faces: lawyers, foster parents, the social worker, and of course, the child at the center of it all. She glanced at Noah, prepared to offer the same neutral, professional look she always did. But the second her eyes met his, her breath caught in her throat. The feeling hit her like a truck, a strange, deep pull in her chest, like a forgotten memory struggling to surface. Noah's gaze locked onto hers, unblinking. "He knows me." The thought made no sense, but it refused to leave her mind. Clearing her throat, she shuffled her papers. "Let's begin," she said. The lawyer for the foster parents stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we are here today to discuss the placement of Noah Bennett, his current foster parents." "I want to stay," Noah blurted. The lawyer frowned. "Noah, I was just about to." "I don't care," Noah said. His voice was steady, unwavering. I want to stay here. I want to stay with her. He turned to Judge Hayes. Because she's my mom. The courtroom exploded into murmurs, gasps, and whispers. Rebecca's heart slammed against her ribs. No, this wasn't happening. This was a mistake. But as Noah took a step closer, as he looked up at her with those deep brown eyes, she wasn't so sure anymore. Outside the courtroom, in the hallways of the courthouse, an old janitor mopped the floors. He was humming to himself, a slow, sad tune, when he overheard the commotion inside. His hands tightened around the mop handle. His gaze flickered toward the courtroom doors, and his face darkened, because he knew something no one else did. Something that, if revealed, would change everything. Forever. The room was spinning. At least, that's how it felt to Judge Rebecca Hayes. She had handled hundreds of cases. Children had cried in her courtroom before. Some had thrown tantrums. Others had begged to stay with families that couldn't keep them. But never, not once, had a child looked at her with the certainty Noah had just shown. You're my mom. Rebecca barely heard the murmurs around her. The attorneys were whispering, the foster parents looked pale, and the social worker was shifting uncomfortably. Finally, she found her voice. Noah, I think you're confused. She kept her tone gentle but firm, the way she always did with children in difficult situations. I am the judge for your case, but I am not your mother. Noah shook his head, his hands clenched into tiny fists. Yes, you are. His conviction sent a chill through her. She exhaled sharply. No one has ever identified your birth mother, Noah. You have been in the system since you were a baby. I know, he whispered, but I remember you. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The foster mother, Mrs. Thompson, cleared her throat. Noah, sweetheart, we talked about this. You know your birth mother is unknown. She looked at the judge apologetically. He's had a hard time lately. He keeps saying things about dreams and memories. Rebecca nodded, grateful for an explanation that made sense. That's understandable. Memories can be tricky, especially for children. Noah turned to the social worker. Tell her. The social worker hesitated. Noah, tell her about the smell. His voice cracked. The room went silent again. Rebecca frowned. What smell? Noah swallowed hard. When I was little, I used to dream about a lady holding me. And I always smelled something, like oranges and cinnamon. His eyes locked onto hers. You smell like that. The hairs on the back of Rebecca's neck stood up. She did wear a lotion that smelled like oranges and cinnamon. She had for years. But that didn't mean anything, right? She forced a smile. Noah, lots of people wear scents like that. But not like yours. His voice was quiet now, but the certainty in it was enough to shake her. It's you. I know it is. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. And then, before she could react, Noah stepped forward and did something that shattered every barrier she had built around herself. He reached out and grabbed her hand. The second his small fingers wrapped around hers, an image flashed through Rebecca's mind. A hospital room. A baby's soft cry. Tiny fingers clutching at her wrist. A name on her lips. She gasped and yanked her hand back. The courtroom blurred. The sound of shuffling papers, murmuring voices, even the feel of her own breath, all of it faded into the background. Because in that moment, for the first time in over a decade, she remembered. 11 years earlier, the hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something faintly sweet, maybe vanilla. The beeping machines hummed in the background, a steady reminder that time was slipping away. Rebecca lay in the bed, her body exhausted but her heart full in a way she had never known before. In her arms, wrapped in a small blue blanket, was the tiniest, most perfect baby boy she had ever seen. Her baby. She stroked his soft cheek, her heart aching with a love so strong it terrified her. She had done everything alone. The pregnancy, the labor, the delivery. No one had been there to hold her hand or tell her it would be okay. But now, looking at this little life in her arms, she realized something. She would never be alone again. She kissed the baby's forehead and whispered his name. And then, the door opened. The doctor walked in, clipboard in hand. His face was kind, but his words cut through her like a blade. It's time. Tears burned her eyes. She knew this moment was coming. She had made her decision long ago, but knowing didn't make it easier. She clutched the baby tighter. I need just a little more time, she whispered. The doctor nodded. I'll give you a few minutes. The door closed. Rebecca looked down at her son, her heart breaking into a million pieces. She had to do this. She had no choice. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "I love you, my little Noah." Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she kissed his forehead one last time and let him go. Present day, Rebecca's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her bench. Noah. That was the name she had given him. The name she had whispered before she had been forced to say goodbye. Her mind raced. Could it be? Could this boy standing before her be the child she had lost? But that was impossible, wasn't it? The courtroom was still watching, waiting for her reaction. She needed to say something. But before she could, a loud bang echoed through the courtroom. The doors had burst open, and in walked the janitor. The same janitor who had been mopping the floors just outside. Only now, he wasn't holding his mop. Now, he was staring straight at Rebecca, and the look in his eyes told her that he knew everything. Every secret, every truth, and whatever he was about to say, it was going to change everything. The janitor stepped into the courtroom, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The room, already tense from Noah's shocking claim, seemed to hold its breath. Judge Rebecca Hayes felt her pulse hammer in her ears. Who was this man? And why was he looking at her like that? The bailiff moved to stop him, but the janitor raised a hand. "I need to speak," he said, his voice rough and steady. "It's about the boy." Noah turned to him, his eyes lighting up with something. Recognition? Rebecca swallowed hard. "Sir, this is a court proceeding. You can't just—" "I have to." The janitor interrupted, his gaze never leaving her face. "Because I know the truth." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Noah's foster parents exchanged worried glances. The social worker looked as confused as Rebecca felt. She tightened her grip on the gavel, trying to regain control of the room. "Who are you?" The janitor took a deep breath. "My name is Samuel Carter," he said, "and I was there the night your son was taken." The gavel slipped from Rebecca's fingers. The courtroom erupted in gasps. "My son." Her voice barely came out. Samuel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. You may not remember me, but I remember you. And I remember Noah. Because I was the one who carried him out of that hospital." Noah's eyes went wide. Rebecca felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her. "That's not possible," she whispered. I gave him up for adoption. He was supposed to be placed with a family. I never thought." "You never thought he was abandoned?" Samuel asked, his expression grim. "Because that's exactly what happened." Silence fell over the room. Rebecca's heart pounded. "What are you saying?" Samuel ran a hand over his face, as if he was carrying a burden that had weighed him down for years. "That baby was never adopted. He was left behind. And I know because I was the one who found him, wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket, with no records, no name, nothing." Rebecca's breath hitched. No, 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 no. She had signed the papers. She had done everything by the book. The agency had promised he would be placed with a good family. Hadn't they? Her stomach churned. "What are you saying?" she demanded. "I'm saying someone lied to you," Samuel said. "Someone made sure you'd never know what happened to your baby. And this boy, this young man right here, was left to fend for himself in the system. No one came for him. No one told you. And now—" He exhaled sharply. "Now he's standing right in front of you, calling you his mother." Rebecca's hands shook as she pressed them against the bench. This was too much. Too fast. "Noah," she breathed, turning to the boy. How did you know?" Noah swallowed. His small hands were balled into fists, his shoulders trembling. "I just knew." A lump formed in Rebecca's throat. "But how?" she whispered. Noah hesitated, then pointed at Samuel. "Because he told me." Rebecca's world tilted. The courtroom held a collective gasp. She turned to Samuel. "You knew? You knew this whole time?" Samuel nodded, his face shadowed with guilt. "I suspected, but I didn't know for sure. Not until now." Rebecca shook her head. This couldn't be real. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you say anything?" Samuel sighed. "Because someone made sure I wouldn't." The room went dead silent. Rebecca felt her breath hitch. Samuel's eyes darkened. "And if you think this ends here, Your Honor, you're wrong. Because the people who did this—" He shook his head. "They're still out there. And they don't want the truth to come out." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. The air in the room shifted. And then, just when she thought the moment couldn't get any worse, a loud crash came from outside the courtroom doors. The sound of shouts. A heavy thud. The bailiff rushed to the door, but before he could open it, the lights flickered. Then, darkness. Total. Complete. Darkness. A scream rang out. And then, nothing. The courtroom plunged into darkness. For a moment, everything was eerily silent. Then, a scream, a crash. Panic erupted. "Stay where you are," the bailiff shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Everyone, stay calm." Rebecca's heart pounded as she gripped the edge of her bench, trying to steady herself. The air felt thick, charged with something dangerous. She couldn't see a thing, but she could feel the tension crackling in the room. "Mom!" Noah's voice rang out through the darkness. The word hit Rebecca like a bolt of lightning. "I'm here," she called back, her voice hoarse. Shuffling footsteps. Something, or someone, moved near the courtroom entrance. Then a low voice. One she didn't recognize. "Get the boy." The words sent an electric jolt through her veins. No. Light flooded back into the room as the emergency backup power kicked in. Rebecca's eyes darted to the entrance. Two men in dark suits stood near the door. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions void of emotion. One of them reached toward Noah. Noah backed away, his eyes wide with terror. "Get your hands off him." Rebecca's voice cracked through the courtroom like a whip. The bailiff moved fast, stepping in front of the men. "I don't know who you are," he said, his hand hovering near his holster. "But you're not taking anyone from this courtroom." One of the men smirked. "We'll see about that." A metallic click. Rebecca's blood ran cold. He had a gun. The courtroom erupted into chaos. "Gun!" someone screamed. People ducked. Chairs scraped against the floor as attorneys and spectators scrambled for cover. Noah froze, his small body trembling. The man with the gun took a step forward. "We don't want trouble," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. "We just want the boy." Rebecca's heart pounded. "Who sent you?" she demanded, forcing herself to sound stronger than she felt. The man ignored her. His eyes locked onto Noah. "Come here, kid," he said. "No one has to get hurt." Noah clenched his fists. "I'm not going with you." A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face, like he hadn't expected resistance from a 10-year-old. Samuel, the janitor, stepped forward. "I don't know who you work for," he said, his voice steady. "But you won't be taking this boy." The man's expression darkened. "You should have kept your mouth shut, old man." Samuel didn't flinch. "And you should have stayed in the shadows where you belong." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the bailiff lunged. The man fired. The shot echoed like thunder in the small room. Someone screamed. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. And then, silence. The bailiff stood frozen, his face twisted in shock. Then, he stumbled. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Blood, dark red, bloomed across his uniform. He collapsed. Noah gasped, horror flashing across his face. Rebecca shot to her feet. "Enough!" she roared, her voice shaking with fury. The gunman barely glanced at her. "Lady, you don't get to make the rules here." But Rebecca wasn't listening anymore. She was done being afraid. With all the force she could muster, she grabbed the heavy wooden gavel from her bench and hurled it straight at the man's hand. The impact was instant. The gun clattered to the floor. The courtroom exploded into action. Samuel tackled the gunman before he could recover. The second man turned to run, but Noah moved first. He grabbed the fallen gun and pointed it at the fleeing man. "Stop," Noah said, his voice trembling. The man hesitated. Noah's hands shook, but his grip didn't loosen. "I said stop," the man sneered. "You don't have the guts, kid." Noah's finger hovered over the trigger. "Try me," he whispered. Samuel wrestled the first man to the ground, pinning him down with surprising strength. The bailiff, bleeding but conscious, forced himself to his feet and grabbed the second man by the collar. "Going somewhere," he rasped. The courtroom doors burst open again. This time, it was uniformed officers. "Drop your weapons." The chaos settled in seconds. The men were disarmed, cuffed, dragged out of the courtroom, but Rebecca barely noticed. Her eyes were on Noah. His small body shook with adrenaline, the weight of the gun too heavy in his hands. Slowly, she stepped forward. "Noah," she said gently. He turned to her, his eyes filled with something raw. Tears threatened to spill down his cheeks. "I was scared," he whispered. She knelt in front of him, carefully taking the gun from his hands. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." He stared at her, searching her face. "Mom." His voice was so quiet, so fragile, it nearly shattered her. Rebecca felt her heart twist. This child, this brave, terrified, stubborn child, was hers. And someone had tried to take him. She wouldn't let that happen. Not ever again. She pulled him into her arms. For the first time in 10 years, she held her son. and she wasn't letting go. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Someone had sent those men. Someone wanted Noah gone. And whoever they were, they would be back. Rebecca held Noah tightly against her chest, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She could feel his small body trembling, his fingers clutching the fabric of her robe. She had spent a lifetime making decisions, delivering verdicts, controlling the chaos of other people's lives. But at this moment, she felt powerless. This was her son, and someone had tried to take him. The courtroom was still a mess. Papers scattered, chairs overturned, whispers spreading like wildfire. The officers had taken the men away, but Rebecca knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Samuel, the janitor, stepped forward, rubbing his wrists. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something deeper. They were hired, he said in a low voice. This wasn't random. Rebecca pulled back slightly and looked at him. Who? Who sent them? Samuel hesitated. Then he looked at Noah. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Noah tensed in her arms. Rebecca frowned, gently cupping his face. Noah? What is he talking about? Noah lowered his gaze, his small hands twisting together. I think I know who wants me gone. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Who, sweetheart? She asked softly. Noah swallowed hard. My old foster family. A cold wave of dread swept over her. Which one? The Smiths. His voice was barely a whisper. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. She had seen dozens of cases involving questionable foster homes. Abuse, neglect, corruption. But she had never imagined her son had suffered through one. What did they do to you? Noah bit his lip, as if afraid to speak. Samuel stepped closer, his expression grim. The Smiths aren't just foster parents, he said. They're part of something bigger, something darker. Rebecca's breath caught. What do you mean? Samuel hesitated, glancing around as if the walls had ears. Then he leaned in. They run a network, he murmured. Children go in, but they don't always come out. A chill ran down Rebecca's spine. What are you saying? She whispered. Samuel's jaw tightened. I'm saying Noah wasn't supposed to survive. Noah shuddered. Rebecca's grip on him tightened. No, this wasn't happening. She looked down at her son. Noah, she said carefully, did they hurt you? Noah nodded, his face pale. Her heart nearly stopped. His voice wavered. They used to lock me in a basement when I wouldn't listen. No food, no light, just me and the dark. Rebecca's fingers dug into the wooden bench. Her entire body shook with rage. I tried to be good, Noah whispered. I tried so hard. But then I found something I wasn't supposed to. Rebecca swallowed hard. What did you find? Noah looked up at her, his dark brown eyes filled with something that made her stomach churn. A list, he whispered. A list of kids. Names. Dates. I don't know where they went, but some of them never came back. Rebecca's breath hitched. Samuel nodded grimly. The Smiths aren't just fostering kids. They're selling them. The air was sucked from her lungs. No, she breathed. Samuel's face was grim. Yes. Noah gripped her hand. That's why they want me gone. Because I saw it. Rebecca felt something inside her snap. No, not again. No one was going to take him from her again. She straightened, her judge's robe feeling heavier than ever. We need to go to the police. We need to. Your Honor. Rebecca turned sharply. One of the officers was standing at the door, his face pale. You need to see this. Something in his voice sent ice through her veins. She carefully set Noah down and followed the officer out of the courtroom. The hallway was eerily silent. Officers stood near the entrance, their faces grim. Rebecca followed the officer outside. And then she saw it. A black SUV was parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine still running. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was the message spray-painted in red across the side of the courthouse. Give US the boy, or more will die. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. This wasn't just about Noah anymore. This was a warning. And it wasn't just for her. It was for everyone. Samuel stepped beside her, his face dark. They aren't done, he muttered. Rebecca clenched her fists. Neither was she. She turned and rushed back into the courthouse, her mind racing. She wouldn't let them win. She wouldn't let them take him. But as she grabbed Noah's hand and held him close, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just fighting for custody anymore. She was fighting for his life. And maybe her own. The message on the courthouse wall burned in Rebecca's mind. Give US the boy, or more will die. This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise, and she knew, without a doubt, that whoever had written it had the power to carry it out. Noah clung to her hand as they rushed back into the courtroom. His small fingers were ice cold. "Mom." His voice was barely above a whisper. Rebecca's chest tightened. He had called her that again, Mom. And she knew, now more than ever, that she would do anything to protect him. She knelt down in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me, Noah. We are going to get out of here, okay? But you have to trust me." He nodded quickly, his dark brown eyes wide with fear. Samuel hovered nearby, his face dark with worry. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "If they're this bold, they might try something now." Rebecca stood. "Then we need to move. Now." But just as she turned toward the exit, the bailiff, pale and still bleeding from his wound, stepped forward. "Judge Hayes," he rasped. "There's something you need to see." She hesitated, torn between fleeing and finding out what new nightmare awaited her. Samuel gave her a sharp look. "You have 5 minutes. Then we get this kid out of here." Rebecca nodded and followed the bailiff to his desk. He grabbed a manila folder, his fingers shaking as he handed it to her. "This was slipped under the door while we were dealing with the shooters," he said grimly. Rebecca opened the folder. Inside was a single piece of paper. It was a birth certificate. Her breath caught in her throat. At the top, printed in official ink, was a name she hadn't seen in years. Baby boy Hayes. Her son. Her Noah. Her hands trembled as she scanned the document. But as she reached the bottom, her heart stopped. The birth mother's name was blank, and in the space where the father's name should have been, there was a name she didn't recognize. Daniel Kincaid. Rebecca's stomach lurched. Who was Daniel Kincaid? Why was his name on her son's birth certificate? The bailiff leaned in. "There's more." He handed her another paper. It was a hospital report, and at the bottom, in scrawled handwriting, was a note. "If she finds out, she dies." Rebecca's breath came fast and shallow. Her mind raced. Someone had erased her from her own son's history. Someone had stolen him away, placed him in a system that never should have had him. And now, that same someone wanted him gone. Her heart pounded as she snapped the folder shut. "We need to leave," she said, turning to Samuel. "Now." Samuel didn't argue. "Let's move." Noah gripped her hand as they hurried out of the courtroom. The officers were still guarding the doors, but the moment Rebecca stepped outside, she felt the danger in the air. The black SUV was still parked across the street. But now, the driver's side window was rolled down, and a man was watching them. A man with cold, calculating eyes. Rebecca felt Noah stiffen beside her. "That's him," he whispered. She didn't need to ask who. The man in the SUV smirked, lifted his hand, and pointed a single finger at Noah. A silent promise. Rebecca's blood turned to ice. She yanked Noah toward the nearest police car. "Get in," she ordered. The officer inside barely had time to react before Samuel jumped in beside them. "Drive," Rebecca commanded. "But, Your Honor." Now, the car screeched forward, tires burning against the pavement. Rebecca twisted in her seat, her pulse hammering as she watched the SUV shrink in the distance. The man didn't chase them. He just sat there, watching, waiting, like he knew something she didn't. And Rebecca had the sinking feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The police car sped through the city streets, weaving through traffic with sirens off. Rebecca's heart pounded as she gripped Noah's hand, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. Noah wasn't just a lost child. He wasn't just another case in the foster system. Someone had stolen him from her. Someone had erased her from his life. And now, that same someone wanted him dead. She turned to the officer driving. "Where are we going?" "The safest place we can take you right now, Judge Hayes," the officer said without looking back. "Headquarters." Rebecca clenched her jaw. "That's not safe. If they found him in my courtroom, they'll find him in a police station." The officer hesitated, but he knew she was right. "Then where do you suggest?" She turned to Samuel, who had been silent this whole time. He was staring out the window, deep in thought. "Samuel," she pressed. "Do you know anywhere safe?" He exhaled. "There's a place." Rebecca didn't like the hesitation in his voice. "Where?" He hesitated. Then, finally, "A church," he said. "Outside the city." "A church." The officer frowned. "It's not just a church," Samuel said. "It's a safe house. The kind people don't know about unless they need it." Rebecca studied his face. "How do you know about it?" Samuel met her gaze. "Because I used to need it." There was something in his voice, something that told her this wasn't the time to ask questions. She turned back to the officer. Take us there. The officer sighed but nodded, turning sharply down a side road. The city disappeared behind them as they headed into the countryside. Noah leaned against her, his small body tense. Are we going to be okay? She wrapped an arm around him. I promise, I won't let anything happen to you. But even as she said the words, her chest tightened, because she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep that promise. 30 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of an old stone church, surrounded by towering oak trees. It looked abandoned, but Samuel stepped out like he had been here 1,000 times. Come on, he said. Rebecca grabbed Noah's hand and followed. The officer stayed behind with the car, his eyes scanning the road. Samuel led them through a side door, down a narrow hallway, and into a large, dimly lit room. A single candle flickered on a wooden table. An old woman sat at the far end, her face partially hidden beneath a black shawl. Rebecca felt Noah stiffen beside her. Samuel cleared his throat. Mother Abigail. The woman lifted her head, her dark eyes locking onto Noah immediately. You brought the boy, she said. A chill ran down Rebecca's spine. You know who he is? Mother Abigail slowly nodded. I've known for a long time. Rebecca's pulse pounded. Then tell me the truth. Who took him from me? The old woman's gaze flickered to Samuel. Then, finally, back to Rebecca. The man who erased your son's past, she said softly. The man who tried to erase you. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Mother Abigail inhaled sharply, as if the name itself carried weight. His name, she whispered, is Daniel Kincaid. Rebecca's blood ran cold. The same name that had been on the forged birth certificate. Noah tensed. Who is he? Mother Abigail's voice was steady. He's the man who sold you. The words slammed into Rebecca like a freight train. She staggered back, gripping the edge of a chair to steady herself. No, this couldn't be real. Samuel's face darkened. You're sure? Mother Abigail nodded. I've been watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come out. And now it has. Rebecca shook her head, trying to force the pieces together. Why? She whispered. Why would he do this? Mother Abigail leaned forward. Because, child, your son was never supposed to be found. Rebecca's stomach twisted. Noah's grip tightened on her hand. But why? She demanded. Why take him? The old woman's face softened. Because, Judge Hayes. She hesitated, then spoke the words that shattered Rebecca's world. Daniel Kincaid isn't just a trafficker. Rebecca's breath hitched. He's your father. The room spun. Noah gasped. Samuel closed his eyes, as if he had been expecting this. Rebecca's knees nearly buckled. No, it wasn't possible. But deep down, in the darkest part of her heart, she knew it was true. Her whole life, she had fought against men like Kincaid, men who saw people as nothing more than property, men who controlled everything in the shadows. She had spent her career putting criminals away, never knowing that the most dangerous one of all had been tied to her by blood. A sick feeling curled in her gut. She had spent years searching for the truth, and now that she had found it, she wished she hadn't. Noah was shaking beside her. Mom. His voice was small, scared. She knelt down, cupping his face. I'm not letting him take you, she whispered fiercely. I don't care who he is. He doesn't own us. Noah nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I don't want to go back. You won't, she promised. But even as she said it, the weight of what she was up against pressed down on her. Her father, a man with money, power, and no soul. She had spent her life delivering justice. Now, she was about to deliver it to him. And she knew, deep in her bones, this was only the beginning of the war. Because Daniel Kincaid had made one fatal mistake. He had tried to take her son, and he was about to find out just how far a mother would go to protect her child. The room was heavy with silence. Rebecca's chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. The words echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of everything she had ever known. Daniel Kincaid is your father. No, it couldn't be. Her father had died when she was a child. Or at least, that's what she had been told. She had never known much about him, just that her mother refused to speak about him. But now, everything, her past, her son's disappearance, the threats, was beginning to take shape. And the shape was monstrous. She slowly rose to her feet, turning to Samuel. You knew, she whispered. Samuel exhaled, running a hand over his face. I suspected. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't have proof, he admitted. And because I knew once you found out, you'd never be able to walk away. Rebecca's fingers clenched into fists. I wouldn't have walked away anyway. Mother Abigail watched her, calm but unreadable. You understand what this means, don't you? Rebecca swallowed. Daniel Kincaid hadn't just stolen her son. He had orchestrated all of it. The adoption that never happened. The years of suffering Noah endured. The men in the courtroom, trying to silence him. The message painted on the courthouse wall. Everything. This wasn't just about getting Noah back anymore. This was about destroying the man who had tried to erase them both. Rebecca met Mother Abigail's gaze. Where is he? The old woman shook her head. He moves like a ghost, hidden in the cracks of the world. But he's watching. He's always watching. Noah shuddered. He won't stop, will he? Rebecca wrapped an arm around him. Not unless we make him. Samuel let out a slow breath. Then we have to be smart. If Kincaid is behind all this, that means the people protecting him, judges, cops, officials, they're everywhere. Rebecca nodded. She knew how deep corruption could run. And if Kincaid had spent years in the shadows, controlling everything, it meant the system wouldn't protect them. They were on their own. She turned to Mother Abigail. What do we do? The old woman studied her for a long moment. Then, she pushed back her chair and stood. We take away what he values most, she said. His power. Rebecca frowned. How? Mother Abigail walked over to a small wooden cabinet and pulled out a rusted tin box. She set it on the table and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of old papers. Samuel's eyebrows furrowed. What is this? Records, she murmured. Things Kincaid thought were destroyed. Rebecca's breath caught as she picked up one of the papers. It was a ledger, a list of names, dates, transactions, and at the top of one of the pages, a note written in careful cursive. Confirmed delivery. No further inquiries. Her stomach churned. These were children. Children who had been sold. She flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. Some names had been crossed out. Others had question marks beside them. And then, she saw it. Her own name. Not Rebecca Hayes. Rebecca Kincaid. She staggered back, the paper slipping from her fingers. Kincaid had never forgotten about her. She had been part of this. Not as a victim, but as a piece in his empire. Her whole life, she had fought against men like him, never knowing she had been born into their world. Your mother hid you from him, Mother Abigail said softly. She ran. Changed your name. But he always knew you were alive. He was waiting for the right time to bring you back into the fold. Rebecca pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. No, she would never be part of that world. She looked at Noah, her son, her real family, and she knew this was why Kincaid had taken him, not just as revenge, but as leverage, to bring her back under his control. Her jaw tightened. That wasn't going to happen. Ever. Samuel picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages. If we expose this, we can take him down. Mother Abigail nodded. But we have to be careful. If Kincaid knows we have this, he won't just send men with guns. He'll burn everything. And everyone. Rebecca set her hands on the table, grounding herself. Then we don't let him see us coming. Samuel smirked. Now that's the kind of judge I like. Noah shifted beside her. What do we do first? Rebecca looked down at the names on the paper. She had spent her life sending criminals to prison. Now, she was hunting one of her own. We start with his network, she said. We cut off his power, one piece at a time. Mother Abigail smiled, slow and knowing. You've just declared war, child. Rebecca straightened. Then let's finish it. But deep in her heart, she knew. This wouldn't be easy. And before it was over, more blood would be spilled. The air inside the church felt heavier now. It was no longer just a place of refuge. It was the starting ground of a war. Rebecca looked down at the ledger again, her fingers skimming over the list of names. Each one represented a child who had vanished, stolen by a machine so well-oiled that no one had noticed until it was too late. She had spent years upholding the law, but this wasn't just about the law. This was about justice. This was about Noah. And she wasn't going to stop until Daniel Kincaid was torn down piece by piece. Samuel leaned over the table, pointing at the pages. These dates, he muttered. They aren't just random transactions. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Samuel flipped a few pages forward. Look at the pattern. Every few months, there's a spike. More names. More children disappearing. Noah shifted uncomfortably. Like shipments. Rebecca's blood ran cold. Exactly, Samuel said grimly. Kincaid isn't just trafficking kids on a case-by-case basis. He's moving them in bulk. A sick feeling curled in Rebecca's stomach. How do we stop him? She asked. Samuel exhaled. We find the next shipment, and we shut it down. Mother Abigail's lips pressed into a thin line. Easier said than done, child. Rebecca met her gaze. Do you know where it's happening? Mother Abigail hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into the tin box and pulled out another paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges, but the address written at the top was clear. Dock 17. Midnight. Rebecca clenched her jaw. Samuel whistled. Well, looks like we just found our next move. Noah tugged on her sleeve. You're not going alone, right? Rebecca knelt beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead. I need you to stay here, Noah, where it's safe. His eyes darkened. I don't want to be safe. I want to help. Her chest tightened. He had been through so much already. She didn't want him anywhere near this darkness again. But she also knew this wasn't just her fight. It was his too. She took his hands. We're going to stop them. I promise. And when this is over, no one will ever come after you again. Noah nodded slowly, though she could see the storm still raging in his eyes. Samuel grabbed his coat. We don't have much time. Mother Abigail stepped forward, holding out a small wooden cross. Take this, she murmured, pressing it into Rebecca's palm. Rebecca frowned. I don't think God can help me where I'm going. The old woman's gaze was steady. It's not for God. It's for you. Rebecca swallowed hard and tucked the cross into her pocket. Then, she straightened. Let's go. Samuel nodded. They were heading straight into the fire, and they had no idea what awaited them on the other side. The docks were silent. Too silent. Rebecca crouched behind a stack of wooden crates, Samuel beside her. The air was thick with salt and something metallic. Oil, maybe. She checked her watch. 11:57 p.m. They were in the right place. But so far, nothing. Samuel frowned. Something's off. Rebecca scanned the darkness. The water lapped gently against the pier, and a few dim security lights flickered overhead. But there were no trucks. No movement. No signs of a shipment. She reached for her phone to text Mother Abigail. But then, a voice. Low. Calculated. You should have stayed in your courtroom, Rebecca. A shiver ran down her spine. She turned slowly. Daniel Kincaid stood in the shadows, his suit crisp, his presence suffocating. Her father. The man who had stolen her child. The man who had stolen so many. Her hands curled into fists. Where are they? She demanded. Kincaid smirked. Where are who? Samuel took a step forward, but Rebecca held up a hand, stopping him. She wouldn't let this turn into a bloodbath. Not yet. Kincaid's eyes gleamed. I have to admit, I underestimated you, he said. I thought you'd play by the rules. But I should have known, he chuckled. You're my daughter, after all. Her stomach churned with disgust. I am nothing like you, she spat. Kincaid tilted his head. Aren't you? Then, he reached into his coat pocket. Samuel tensed, ready to pounce. But Kincaid didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a phone. Rebecca's breath caught. The screen lit up. A live video feed. Her heart stopped. Noah, tied to a chair. Tears streaked his face. A man stood behind him, a knife pressed against his throat. Rebecca's world shattered. Kincaid smiled. You wanted a war, Rebecca? He held the phone up higher. Now you've got one. The line went dead. And Rebecca Hayes, judge, protector, mother, was out of time. Rebecca's world went silent. Noah, tied to a chair, a knife at his throat. Her body screamed to move, to act, to do something, but she was frozen, trapped between the horror on that screen and the man standing before her. Daniel Kincaid smirked, slipping the phone back into his pocket. You should have stayed out of this, Rebecca. His voice was calm, almost amused. Now, look where we are. Samuel stiffened beside her, his fists clenched. Where is he? Kincaid ignored him, his cold gaze locked onto Rebecca. I've given you a choice, daughter. The word dripped with mockery. You hand over the ledger, and you walk away with the boy. Rebecca's fingers curled into fists. And if I don't? Kincaid sighed, almost disappointed. Then the next time you see him, it'll be in a body bag. Rage surged through her veins, blinding, all-consuming. Samuel grabbed her arm before she could lunge. Not yet, he muttered. Think. But Rebecca couldn't think. Not when her son, her Noah, was somewhere out there, terrified and alone. She forced herself to breathe. Stay calm. Stay focused. You made a mistake, Kincaid, she said, her voice low. His smile didn't waver. Oh, you should have killed me first. Then, a gunshot. The crates behind them exploded into splinters. Samuel yanked Rebecca down just as another shot rang out. The docks erupted into chaos. Shadows moved, men, armed and closing in fast. A setup. It had been a setup all along. Samuel cursed, pulling his own gun. We need cover. Rebecca's mind raced. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Noah was still missing. Another shot. Then another. Samuel fired back, dropping one of Kincaid's men. We can't stay here. Rebecca grabbed the ledger from inside her coat. Kincaid wants this, she growled. Then let's make sure he doesn't get it. Before Samuel could stop her, she threw it. The ledger spun through the air and landed in the water with a heavy splash. Kincaid's face darkened. You stupid girl, he snarled. But Rebecca was already moving. Samuel covered her as they sprinted toward the edge of the dock. A boat was tied nearby, small, rusted, but running. A way out. Samuel fired at the approaching men. Get in now. Rebecca leaped onto the boat, fumbling for the controls. The engine sputtered, barely alive, then roared to life. Samuel jumped in after her. Go. Rebecca yanked the throttle. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the dark water. Bullets splintered the railing behind them, but they were moving too fast now. The gunfire faded. The dock disappeared. And Daniel Kincaid, his expression cold, unreadable, watched them vanish into the night. 15 minutes later, the boat drifted into a quiet, hidden cove. Rebecca's hands shook as she shut off the engine. She turned to Samuel, her breath ragged. Where would he take Noah? Samuel wiped sweat from his forehead. Somewhere off the grid. Kincaid has properties all over. Then how do we find him? Samuel hesitated. We don't. Rebecca's blood ran cold. What? Samuel exhaled. Not unless we do something drastic. She clenched her jaw. Like what? His gaze was steady. We let him find us. Silence. Then, Rebecca understood. Kincaid wanted something from her. The ledger was gone, but she still had something more valuable. Herself. If she surrendered, Kincaid would bring her to Noah. And that was exactly what she wanted. Her heart pounded. The thought of walking straight into the hands of a monster made her stomach twist. But what other choice did she have? Samuel frowned. If you do this, you might not come back. Rebecca exhaled. As long as Noah does, she whispered. That's all that matters. Samuel cursed under his breath. Then, reluctantly, he pulled out a burner phone. If we're doing this, he muttered, we do it right. He dialed. The line clicked. And then, Daniel Kincaid's voice, smooth as ever. You're smarter than I thought. Rebecca's grip tightened. I'm coming to you. A pause. Then, amusement. Good girl. Her stomach turned. You let Noah go first. Unharmed. Kincaid chuckled. You don't make the rules, Rebecca. Her pulse pounded. She was running out of time. You get me, she said, her voice steady. Or you get nothing. Silence. Then, fine. The line went dead. Rebecca exhaled shakily. Samuel rubbed his face. I hate this plan. So do I. She looked out at the dark water. Somewhere out there, her son was waiting. And she was going to get him back. No matter the cost. The air was thick with tension as Rebecca stood in the abandoned warehouse, the meeting place Daniel Kincaid had chosen. She had walked into the lion's den before, but never like this. This time, the lion was her own flesh and blood, and he held her son's life in his hands. Samuel had been furious when she insisted on coming alone. He had tried to stop her, to talk sense into her, but she had been unmoved. This was the only way. Now, standing beneath the dim overhead lights, she steadied herself. She had to stay sharp, no matter what Kincaid had planned. A door creaked open. Rebecca turned. And there he was. Daniel Kincaid stepped into the warehouse like a king surveying his empire. His black suit was crisp, his silver hair neatly combed back. He looked nothing like the monster she knew him to be. And yet, he was exactly that. Behind him, two men dragged Noah forward. His wrists were bound, his face pale with fear. Mom! Noah cried, struggling against their grip. Rebecca's heart clenched. Kincaid raised a hand. Let him go. The guards hesitated, then released Noah. He stumbled forward. Rebecca caught him, wrapping her arms around him as tightly as she could. Are you okay? She whispered. Noah nodded against her shoulder, his small body trembling. Kincaid smiled. See? I keep my word. Rebecca straightened, pushing Noah behind her. Then let's end this. Kincaid's eyes gleamed. So eager. I always knew you had my fire. Her stomach twisted with disgust. I am nothing like you. Kincaid chuckled. We'll see about that. He gestured toward the far side of the warehouse. A single chair sat beneath a hanging light. Rebecca's breath caught. A gun rested on the seat. Kincaid's smile widened. You want to save your son? Then prove it. Her pulse thundered. What do you mean? Kincaid took a slow step forward. You've always believed in justice, haven't you, Rebecca? That's what makes you a great judge. His expression darkened. But justice doesn't exist in my world. Only power. He nodded toward the gun. You want Noah to walk out of here alive? Then take it. Rebecca's hands clenched. You want me to kill you? She asked coldly. Kincaid smirked. Oh no. I don't want you to kill me. He snapped his fingers. Another door opened. A man was dragged inside. His face bloodied, his hands tied. Rebecca's stomach lurched. It was Samuel. His one good eye flicked up, barely registering her presence. He had fought. Hard. And lost. Your friend here made quite the mess, Kincaid said casually. And now, you have a choice. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Take the gun, he whispered. Shoot him. Prove to me that you are more than just a woman in a robe. Rebecca's entire body went cold. He wanted her to kill Samuel. He wanted to break her. She glanced at Noah, who was frozen in terror. His wide, brown eyes darted between her and Kincaid. This was a test. And no matter what she did, Kincaid thought he had already won. Rebecca inhaled sharply. Then, she stepped forward. She picked up the gun. Kincaid's smirk grew. There's my girl. Rebecca turned the weapon in her hands, feeling its weight. It was cold. Heavy. A death sentence. She exhaled. Then, in one swift motion, she turned and aimed it at Kincaid. His guards reacted instantly, reaching for their weapons. But Rebecca was faster. She pressed the barrel against Kincaid's forehead. The room went still. No one dared to move. Kincaid's smirk faltered. Let them go, Rebecca ordered, her voice like steel. Kincaid chuckled. You won't do it. Her grip tightened. Try me. Silence. Then, Kincaid's lips curled. You are my daughter after all. Rebecca swallowed the bile rising in her throat. Then, something shifted in his gaze. Something dark. And she knew. He wasn't afraid. Because he had a plan. And she had just walked straight into it. The next moment, the warehouse doors burst open. Gunfire. Chaos. Noah screamed. Rebecca pulled the trigger. But the gun clicked empty. A setup. It had been empty all along. A fist slammed into her ribs. Pain exploded through her. She hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The room was spinning. She could hear Noah shouting her name. Could hear Samuel struggling against his captors. And through the chaos, Kincaid's laughter rang out. You never stood a chance, he murmured. Rebecca's vision blurred. Then, a loud crash. A flood of footsteps. And suddenly, men in tactical gear swarmed the room. Gunshots. Kincaid's guards fell. Voices barked commands. Rebecca tried to sit up, her head pounding. Samuel was free, his hands untied. And standing behind him, the FBI. Kincaid's smirk disappeared. Samuel grinned through a bloody lip. Took you long enough, he muttered. One of the agents stepped forward, gun trained on Kincaid. Daniel Kincaid, you're under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, and attempted murder. For the first time, Kincaid looked truly surprised. Rebecca pushed herself to her feet, wincing. She turned to Samuel. You called them? Samuel wiped blood from his nose. What? You think I'd let you do this alone? Relief crashed through her. Noah ran to her, throwing his arms around her waist. Mom, he choked out. I thought. She held him close. I'm here, she whispered. I'm never letting go. Kincaid's hands were forced behind his back. His jaw tightened as the cuffs locked around his wrists. You think this is over? He sneered. Rebecca stepped forward, looking him dead in the eye. It is for you. The agents dragged him away. And just like that, it was over. Rebecca sank to her knees, holding Noah tightly. For the first time in years, she let herself cry. The nightmare was over. She had won. And she had her son back. The weight of everything crashed down on Rebecca as she sat on the cold warehouse floor, Noah clinging tightly to her. It was over. The FBI had taken Daniel Kincaid away in cuffs. His men were either dead, arrested, or running for their lives. For the first time in 10 years, the man who had stolen everything from her, her son, her peace, her past, was finally gone. She closed her eyes, pressing her lips against Noah's hair. He was safe. That was all that mattered. Samuel crouched beside her, rubbing his bruised wrists. Well, he muttered, that was fun. Rebecca let out a breathless laugh, still shaking. Fun isn't the word I'd use, she rasped. Samuel smirked. You're welcome, by the way. She glanced at him, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. For what? He gestured to the chaos around them. For calling the cavalry. And, saving your life. Rebecca exhaled, her heart still pounding. I should be mad at you. But you're not, he said with a knowing grin. She shook her head. No, I'm not. Because without him, she never would have made it out alive. The FBI agents moved around them, securing the warehouse. One of them approached, a woman in a dark suit. Judge Hayes. Rebecca looked up. Yes. The agent offered a respectful nod. I'm Special Agent Claire Morrison. I've been tracking Kincaid's operation for years. She hesitated. We never expected to take him down this way, but it worked. Rebecca scoffed. I didn't expect it either. Morrison's gaze shifted to Noah. And this is the boy. Noah pressed closer to Rebecca, his small hands gripping her robe. Yes, Rebecca said firmly, wrapping an arm around him. Morrison's expression softened. We'll be conducting a full investigation into Kincaid's network. But as far as the law is concerned, this child belongs to you. Rebecca's breath caught. Are you saying? Morrison smiled. No more hearings. No more paperwork. No more questions. The system failed him once. We're not letting it happen again. Tears burned Rebecca's eyes. She had fought so hard, lost so much. And now, she had won the only battle that had ever mattered. Noah was hers. For real. Forever. She buried her face in his curls, holding him close. You hear that, baby? She whispered. No one can take you from me now. Noah clung to her. I love you, Mom. Rebecca's heart nearly broke. I love you too, sweetheart. So much. Samuel stood, stretching. So what now? Rebecca wiped her tears, looking around at the wreckage. Now they got to live. She rose to her feet, keeping Noah close. We go home, she said softly. Samuel nodded. And after that, Rebecca met his gaze. Then, she said, we make sure this never happens to anyone else. Because for every child in that ledger, there was another mother still searching. Another family still broken. And Rebecca Hayes wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. But tonight, she was just a mother, holding her son, finally whole, finally free. And as she carried Noah toward the waiting car, she whispered the words she had been waiting 10 years to say. We're going home.